Okay, so I want to sum up some of what I said and introduce a few more things as a quick do's and don'ts, and then we're just going to, especially since we're going kind of long, we're going to go over a discussion on creatures, and I will take open questions in the next section on it as we look at some dragons and some other things and just talk about them a little bit to get the creative juices flowing while you contemplate what you want to model this week. Okay, so one, not often thought about, but something that's important if you're going to model them in flight or if you're going to work on a pipeline, and you can share this with people further up the pipeline, but bigger flyers should actually flap their wings less. To some degree less in terms of how often, but especially less in terms of how far they flap. And you will see complaints sometimes from people, from producers, and you may or may not be able to overcome them, that say, well, it doesn't look like they're flying if they don't really flap their wings hard. But I actually think that probably, in reality, gives the big, famous flying dragons the fake look that they often have, because those giant wings often end up moving faster and sustaining greater forces than they could actually withstand. And so, like, you'd be creating animals that would just snap their wings as they tried to fly like that, and that's a bad thing. Second of all, a general observation, flying is hard and it takes lots of muscles. And the reason I bring this up is, especially with pterosaurs and some dragons, you'll see ridiculously skinny runway model-like creatures that are like skin and bones, as if to make them light. It's a myth that flying animals are incredibly not dense. Even birds, which have all those air sacs, once you add all the weight from the feathers on, are still very close to being similarly dense for their size. And pterosaurs had less extensive, well, they had very hollow bones, but they would have made up for it with lots of extensive muscles on the outside. So none of these guys were like super light air beings, and nor could they get away with having like no muscles there. Flying requires a lot of energy, and they need to be solidly built, especially in the parts that actually do the flying. Now, if you want to make the hind limbs smaller in a bat or pterosaur winged animal because they don't have to use them so much, that's great. But don't make the body don't see the ribs, don't make the necks have no muscles. All those muscles are really important, and they need to be there, and they need to be stout. And then there are some consistencies here to body proportions. You really need to have the torsos be short and stiff for animals to actually fly. That's one thing we'll look at in dragons, but unfortunately those beautiful, long, lizardy, flexible hind limb, backed dragons really are not realistic, and the bigger they get, the less realistic it gets. Short hind limbs are actually pretty good. If you have to have long hind limbs like some birds that fly, you want to tuck all of the muscles up as close to the body as you can. Get those drumsticks really high, shorten the upper bones, and lengthen the lower limb bones. Or in animals like bats and pterosaurs, the hind legs should just be a lot shorter than the forelimbs most of the time. And honestly, I'd like to see a lot of dragons like that. And really, because they're not using, even if they use the tail originally to move around quickly, there's no reason they have to have long, meaty tails once they start flying like that. Okay, another thing that's important is actually think about in your design how they're going to take off. If they are going to take off on their hind legs, well, that's fine, but maybe you need to design a more bird-inspired dragon then. Maybe a wyvern that's bipedal with wings. And if not, pay attention to what bats and pterosaurs do, because birds are actually the weirdos in this case, and using them as your design inspiration for, say, dragons is not such a good idea. Even in griffins, if the griffins are going to actually fly rather than just having wings, making the lion haunches perhaps less important might be a still pretty good solution to save on some weight. Here's an interesting point. Flyers do not turn with tail rudders. I know some pterosaurs have long tails with little doohickeys at the end, and so there were discussions again through much of the last century before wind tunnel tests which suggested that maybe those help them turn, just like the same people who thought maybe crests on their heads did. This is a no-no, and in wind tunnels it does not work. Those ones with long tails with little mini-looking kites at the end, apparently it was just to help keep the tail behind them, or else to look good. It was not there to help the aerodynamics. So, and I think this is important, if you're sculpting for yourself, that's totally fine. Just don't pose the tail in a way that looks like it's turning. But if you're sculpting for a pipeline, you might want to either consider not putting long tails on your flyers, or at least sharing with your riggers and animators these facts, because otherwise it's very tempting as an animator when you get a model to use all the parts to make it look functional. Like, oh, he gave it this great tail, I'd better do something with this tail. And so it's something to really think about if you're working on a team, is will that part of the design be used properly or misused, and should that help guide where the design is going? That said, you can have lots of design flexibility because crests and other tchotchkes on the head, even the back, can be there, and they can be big. They can be crazy. They seem to usually be vertical, and they are always narrow side to side, so that even though they're big and they create drag, it minimizes the drag. But within those rules, you can do tons of crazy stuff with them, and you should if you want. Okay, so that's kind of like the main summary. At this point, I'll open it to questions, and we're going to go through and actually look and talk about some of these images, just in general as like do's and don'ts. Tchotchke is like TS. Well, I'd have to look that up now, Michael. Google it. It'll spell it for you, I'm sure.